Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. I'm so glad you could join us today. And this is going to be a little bit different from what we normally do. For those of you that normally attend, I tend to talk a little bit more about philosophy. But Katya had asked if we could do something in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month that dealt with something along the lines of mental health. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started here. So the topic that we're looking at for today is resilience for knowledge workers. And like I said, this isn't a topic I've normally been speaking about, so it'll be kind of fun to see how this comes together. Couple things real quick. I am sharing my personal experience. I'm not a doctor or a therapist. If you're excited about any of the stuff that we share here, please take it up with your own health professional if you have any questions or thinking about pursuing any of the ideas. Just want to give that quick clarification. So most of us are from New Rocket. There may be a couple of people from outside of New Rocket that are here today. But at that company, we are primarily what we call knowledge workers. So what would you say, and it's okay to participate here, is the primary tool we use for our job?
The brain, I suppose.
Exactly. So our brain is our primary tool.
Hello.
So this is what we need to be working on or thinking about when we're talking about how we perform as knowledge workers. And the topics I want to cover then, or the goals that I'm hoping to achieve, is how can we then work towards being able to have clearer thinking, sustained focus, emotional stability, and improved memory. So these are the things that I've been concerned about for many years. I started this journey, I was looking back, it was probably about 10 years ago when I had my first cup of bulletproof coffee. I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but this was the beginning of my awareness of a trend called biohacking, which was all about how do we optimize the human body for performance. And in particular, I was very concerned about mental performance because that's my primary area of working. So let's jump in. A couple of these things I think you're going to find pretty standard that you hear a lot, and there'll be some that are maybe a little bit different. I want to start by making a particular note about how we've engaged with thinking about our brains and our minds. So sometimes these seem like two different things. And in the early days, when there were severe mental disorders and they would do autopsies on people and they would look at the brains, they couldn't really tell any difference between people who had normally functioning brains and people who didn't. And so they didn't think there was a lot of biological connection to what was happening with these mental disorders. And so it tended to focus more on psychosocial type of questions. And this is where you see people like Freud and Jung springing up and dealing with talk therapy and so forth. And it wasn't until much later that we started to be able to understand what was happening at the brain from a biochemical perspective and others, that the functioning of the brain, even when we're thinking about mental health questions, actually has a lot to do with the performance of the brain, that there's a strong nutritional component to this whole process. And there's even emerged new areas of psychology now that initially were called nutritional psychology. And now I think there's even one called metabolic psychology. So this is where I'm going to be focusing, is looking at what can we do in terms of our daily habits and behaviors to really optimize how well our brain is going to work for us. Number one is we need to think about sleep. And there's a lot of discussion about how much we need, but it seems to be fairly consistent that they're saying somewhere between 5 and 8 hours. And everybody's going to be a little bit different on that. And so we need to just kind of experiment a bit to find out, when do I really feel rested? And the other thing that is important is consistency. And this is a difficult thing for a lot of people because we get excited about participating in different events. And so we might be up late one night and go to bed early the next. And this can actually be a little devastating in terms of the impact it's going to have on our functioning. Finding a regular pattern for how you can have, as much as possible, a consistent time that you go to bed and a consistent time you wake up is really going to help to set your circadian rhythm. And that's going to improve a lot of how our mental functioning works. When we sleep, a lot is happening with our brain, including, if you're thinking from an IT perspective about what databases do, sometimes we have a process where we re-index. And in some respects, this is happening with our brains when we're sleeping. And so the sleep is a very important part of that process. Another thing that we can do to improve our sleep is to think about light. So, one of the things that impacts our circadian rhythm is exposure to blue light. It helps us to think that this is the time we're supposed to be awake. And unfortunately, things like our computers and TVs and phone screens all emit typically a blue light, which is counterproductive to trying to go to sleep. So if you find that this is something where you struggle with being able to get to sleep easily, you might think about limiting the amount of time that you have with something like blue light when you're trying to get ready for bed, maybe for about a half hour or an hour ahead of time. Just stop using those things. One of the items that I've found, because I do like to read, is a Kindle device actually can be backlit, that it doesn't actually generate blue light. And so if you like to read, and maybe it's in bed or something and you don't want to disturb your partner, having something like that can work well without having to turn on an actual light. And then the other thing is temperature. It's actually better to be a little bit cooler when you sleep instead of warm. And sometimes people like to get really bundled up and turn up the temperature at night, but you'll actually sleep better when you're a little bit cooler and actually warm up when it's time to wake up. The other thing is there's a number of things that we can ingest that can impact how well we sleep. So obviously caffeine is a stimulant, and I've known some people who somehow can drink a cup of coffee just before they go to bed, and it doesn't seem to impact them. I'm not sure how that works exactly. But from what I understand, this can actually be impacting the sleep, even if it doesn't seem like it stops you from going to sleep. Also, alcohol and food. These things really should be abstained for at least several hours before you go to bed so that you can have a better quality of sleep. Caffeine, maybe even much earlier, maybe as much as 10 hours. And sometimes they would say alcohol, you want to really back that off a ways, but also food. You don't want to go to bed on a full stomach, actually. And then another thing that's been really interesting, people have been looking at melatonin as a sleep aid for quite some time, but they're now seeing, even if you're not having problems going to sleep, that melatonin might actually be really effective at helping the brain do what it needs to do in terms of go through its processing, help to consolidate the memories and the learning that's happened during the day. So this is something, if you're curious, you might want to look into a little bit more about how people are using melatonin more as a like a nootropic. And a nootropic is a term for different types of drugs or chemicals that somebody might take to help improve brain performance. So here is the big one, and this is the one that's going to be the most complicated because there's a lot of different thoughts that people have about nutrition. Obviously, how we eat can be both an emotional component to it, there can be faith components to it, there can be ethical components to it, as well as just um, general ideas about conflicting scientific information that people are trying to follow. So, rather than try to explain everything and all the possible ways that we can look at this, I'm going to be speaking more directly from how I have approached it, which I realize might not work for everybody, but I think it will give you some ideas to start thinking through. And if there are some questions about this, I'm happy to talk about it as well. And Katri, I see there's a couple of things in the chat, so I'm going to depend on you to help bring those up for me because I can't really see them. All right, so when we're thinking about nutrition and we're thinking about mental performance, there's a couple of key things we really need to pay attention to. One is inflammation, and the other is metabolic health. So when we're talking about metabolic health, almost all of the cells in our body have little um, pieces within them that are called mitochondria. And these mitochondria are what we use to develop energy or to produce energy. And so how well they function at producing energy is what we're talking about in terms of metabolic health. And the places where we have the greatest concentration of mitochondria are in our brain and in our heart. And so what we can do to help promote mitochondrial health, metabolic health, is going to have a big impact on our brain. It only takes up a small percentage of our total body in terms of weight, but it actually uses a great deal of energy compared to the rest of the body. So the brain has a lot of energy demands. If it's not being fed properly, if those mitochondria aren't functioning properly, the brain's not going to function properly. And we're going to experience it maybe in mild things like just what sometimes is called brain fog, or it could be more serious issues of either things like depression or Alzheimer's or a number of different things that can happen neurologically. Now, one of the things that I have found and that is really fascinating is that insulin resistance is probably one of the number one issues behind how metabolic health is affected. And there's been studies that have said that there's upwards of 88% of the adult population in the US suffers from insulin resistance. And the trick here is that we don't necessarily realize this because our body has ways of coping with it. Now, sometimes insulin resistance has been talked about as pre-diabetes. And so most of us are thinking in terms of diabetes, that we're concerned about our blood sugars or our blood glucose becoming too high and not being able to come back down on a timely manner. The issue with this is that we can be suffering for insulin resistance for quite some time before we actually see issues affecting glucose levels in the blood. And this is where the problem comes in, of not realizing that we might be wrestling with insulin resistance. They do have tests now that you can take to measure your insulin in your blood, but I don't think there's a home test at this point. I think you still have to go in and actually have this checked in a lab, but they do have those available now. So what the issue is here is insulin is a powerful hormone that affects literally every cell in our body. It's one of the few hormones that does that. And one of the key features that it does is it helps us to be able to take this glucose or this sugar from our blood into the cell to be used by the mitochondria to create energy. And what insulin resistance is referring to is when the cells start to become resistant to insulin, which prevents then the glucose from entering into the cell for energy and causes the blood glucose levels to rise. And so what we have here is a situation where we're not getting enough energy into our cells. And there's also some issues with having excess glucose in the blood. What the body will do to try and resolve this is produce more and more insulin. And so you have an increase in insulin as well as an increase in glucose. And what's fascinating is that for people who suffer from type 2 diabetes, which is what this situation leads to, is one of the ways they treat the high glucose levels is by giving injections of more insulin, which is actually compounding the problem. And it's a known issue. It's something that they wrestle with in terms of how to keep these things in check. The answer to it is primarily from a diet and an exercise perspective, but that's very hard to get people to do. And so relying on something like a shot or a pill has become more of the standard way of treating it, but unfortunately, it's not very effective. And so what I'm going to look at is what we do from a diet perspective, because this is going to provide, again, the brain with that optimal metabolic health, whether we're dealing with that insulin resistance or not. But especially if we are, this is going to give us a lot of benefit. The other thing that I like about understanding this insulin resistant kind of centric perspective is there are a number of health issues that are related to this. So cardiovascular health, including things like high blood pressure and arterial sclerosis, as well as a lot of mental concerns, whether we're talking about Alzheimer's, which a lot of people are referring to now as type 3 diabetes, as well as general mental functioning. Even some other things like depression can lead to, or can stem from this insulin resistance. Some of the top cancers, in particular breast cancer and prostate cancer, are related to this. So by focusing on this one issue, on this concern about insulin resistance, we actually tackle a whole host of physiological issues that we might need to be dealing with. In fact, I recently came across a book that goes into some good detail on this. It's called Why We Get Sick. If you're interested in pursuing this in more detail, this is a book that I just recently got it, and it really covers a lot of this information very well. So, what do we do? How insulin gets high, that starts the process of the insulin resistance. Where there's three main macronutrients that we eat. Those are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And carbohydrates generate a very strong insulin response because they create a lot of blood glucose, and it needs to be taken up by the cells, and so it's going to increase that level of insulin. What happens in a lot of the standard American diet is we eat a lot of carbs, especially refined carbs, and we eat frequently. And so what happens is we have these blood levels of insulin go up high, and they stay up high, and they don't ever have a chance to come back down. And it's this high elevated insulin in the blood sugar, or in the blood, that is bringing about this insulin resistance. The mechanism that's used to receiving that insulin is getting essentially overwhelmed, and it starts to not function as well. So one of the key things from a dietary perspective to look at is how do we reduce the number of carbs that we're actually eating so that we're not driving those insulin numbers up. So the other two macronutrients we can look at, protein and fats. Proteins have a minimal impact on what happens with the blood glucose and the insulin response, and then fats have zero impact on it. And for many, many years, we've been taught that fat is bad, especially saturated fat. And this is something that unfortunately crept into the public opinion and public health through not necessarily scientific studies, but had to do more with political or profit motive means. And there's a lot of studies and research that have been done on this. One of the books that really kind of broke this out in detail was called The Big Fat Lie. And that's a really interesting book if you're curious about that. But what we're looking at here is if we are able to reduce the carbs and actually increase the fat, then we have a way of essentially bypassing what's happening with insulin. So our body has two main sources it can use from energy. One is the glucose that's just coming from the sugars and the carbs, and the other is from fats. And a key thing to keep in mind here is that simply eating fat does not equal blood fat. So we used to be concerned if we had high cholesterol that we didn't want to eat egg yolks because egg yolks had cholesterol, but there's not a link between what we're eating in terms of cholesterol and what's in our blood in terms of cholesterol. The blood fat panel is actually created in different mechanisms. It doesn't go straight from our food into the blood. And actually increasing the fat can have a strong impact on reducing blood fat. one of the issues that got me started in this is I was also dealing with pre-diabetes and also with a condition of hypertriglyceridemia, where just from some type of genetic situation, I would happen to have high triglycerides, where normal high is about 150. Mine would sometimes be as high as 1600. And my increase specifically of eating triglycerides, in this case, medium chain triglycerides, brought those numbers way down and fast. So there's not a one-to-one correlation in terms of eating fat versus having fat in the blood. But what happens here is if we're switching over to having more of fat for the energy, our body has a whole another mechanism it can use where it translates these fats into ketones, and those can be used by the mitochondria without having to use insulin. So this is what is often called a ketogenic type diet, where you're reducing the carbs, you're increasing the fats, and you're having moderate protein. And this will completely, assuming that you don't have other underlying issues going on, be able to reset what's happening with your insulin sensitivity. So it's a extremely powerful way of getting those numbers turned around, which is going to help with that metabolic health, that doesn't require any kind of medication and is actually way more effective than just trying to do something with exercise. So the key things that you'd be looking at here if you're trying to implement this is any type of refined carbohydrates would be things that you want to try and cut out of your diet. So this is going to be obviously things like sugar, but also things like pastas and breads, which I know a lot of people really enjoy, but those things will definitely have a big impact on what's happening with insulin in your system. And then there's a number of different diets you can look at in terms of that are more ketogenic based, ranging from things like the paleo diet to keto diet to at a far extreme, something like the carnivore diet. What's fascinating here is that there is no essential carb for your body. You don't have to eat anything in terms of a carbohydrate. You can live 100% and healthy on just meat, for example. However, if you try to live 100% on plants, you will have to at least supplement with vitamin B12, which only comes from animal sources and they can't be found in plant sources. And that is essential for how we live. There are ways to do more of a low carb, high fat diet from a plant based perspective. I'm not as familiar with that, but there are ways that that can work. So, the other thing that's interesting is if we have excess glucose in our system, it's going to be stored. And this is one of the other roles that insulin plays, is it's going to divert this excess energy into fat stores. But if we're actually processing ketones for energy, these don't get stored. And what happens is we excrete, if we have more than we need, either through our breath or through our urine, it's not retained. And so we actually have a benefit of not keeping extra calories or carbs, or not carbs, but the calories from the energy if we're having more of a ketone base versus glucose base for how we are processing energy in our bodies. Then a couple of other things along this line. So when we're thinking about mental functioning, it might not be a big surprise to anybody that alcohol isn't actually productive in terms of our brains functioning properly. So if this is a high priority for you, you might want to think about how much you
Wow.
drink or if you drink. But this will be a key thing to consider. Caffeine, there's a little bit of kind of mixed thought on this in terms of how it helps with brain functioning. So I mentioned earlier this idea of bulletproof coffee, which, if you're not familiar with it, is taking regular coffee, and adding to it an amount of butter as well as MCT oil, which is medium chain triglycerides, and blending it up together. It kind of tastes like a latte, but it's getting a lot of those fats into the system along with caffeine, and it has a tremendous impact. At least it did for me in terms of my ability to focus and my ability to just really sustain energy throughout the day, throughout the morning while I was working, especially as a programmer. So some people will definitely look at using caffeine as more of a nootropic way to help improve brain function. Other people are not as big on caffeine. You'll just have to look at some of the different ways that people talk about it out there, but certainly it's a very commonly used drug that a lot of us are familiar with. Um, but there, you'll just have to figure out which way kind of works best for you. Now, nicotine, and I'm hesitant to talk about this because this is a very difficult one without people getting really concerned. But there has been a lot of research recently on the nootropic benefits of nicotine. And when I'm talking about nicotine in this perspective, I am not talking about tobacco based nicotine. So this is not from cigarettes. This is not from dip or cigars. This is a non tobacco based nicotine. The carcinogen effects of smoking or the concerns with that are not present in nicotine itself. It's only in the rest of what gets packaged up when you're receiving it in terms of from a tobacco product. Not quite as sure about the situation with vaping, but from what I understand, there's still concerns about how this would happen in terms of the benefit for your lungs, if it's what kind of impact vaping has. But they do have nicotine that you can get in a couple of different forms that is not tobacco based and you don't have to inhale it. One of them is kind of a spray that you can just do on the back of your throat. Another is some like little lozenge that you can just put in the side of your cheek and let it dissolve. And the other is the gum that you can chew. And this is actually a very powerful nootropic in terms of really helping the brain focus and to help in the memory retention process. It also is supposed to have some different preventative effects in terms of protection from neurological decline. This may still actually have a level of addictiveness to it. So you'll definitely want to take that into consideration if you're wanting to explore this. But at the end, I'm going to have some links where you can kind of understand or start on the process of trying to understand a little bit more of how nicotine is being used as a nootropic. And then creatine, which you may have been familiar with if somebody's thinking about trying to put on muscle mass or they're working out. Part of how creatine works is it really nourishes and increases growth in mitochondria. And so even though it's helpful from a muscle building perspective, it's also turns out to be really helpful in terms of helping cognitive function. So our mental energy production can be increased by the use of creatine as well, which again is going to help with that prolonged ability to focus and stay engaged in mind intensive activities. So there's a lot that we brought up in this section here. And I imagine there might be some questions. So I'm going to pause for a minute and see what kind of questions we have.
We do have one in the chat, Jim, asking about caffeine. How much caffeine is too much?
So one of the things that I've heard is if you get to the point where you're feeling jittery or on edge, you've kind of overdosed. So up to that point, and it's going to be different for different people, would still be considered like a fine amount. The other impact you want to look at, aside from getting to that like jittery point, is what effect it's having on your ability to sleep. So with caffeine, the primary thing I think you need to be concerned is not having too much at one time and also not having it too close to the time that you go to bed. The other thing that they find is that there's a cutoff in which you're actually experiencing benefits from caffeine. So even if you haven't, in a sense, gone over your limit to the point where you're getting jittery, you might not actually be receiving any additional benefit from it. So trying to keep it maybe a little bit more reduced, say to 1 to maybe 3 cups or something like that in the morning. And by cups, I'm talking about 8 ounces, not like a full coffee mug. Might be one of the places you start. The other thing people will notice is if they drink coffee regularly, coming off of coffee can, of course, give you the headaches and so forth. So if you have smaller amounts, you'll remain a little bit more sensitive to the effects of caffeine, and it might be easier if you need to go without caffeine for a period of time. Yeah, so this would be one of the areas where you're going to have a tremendous impact in terms of the ability to have energy for the brain to be able to focus, to be able to process those memories, and continue what we're trying to do in terms of knowledge workers, being able to retain our focus and not get worn out before the end of the day. It's also going to have, if we're dealing with that insulin resistance, a tremendous impact on all these other health areas that we may be concerned about. So you really get to not just, get 2 for 1 here, but, 3 or 4 types of items that we can improve on just on this one aspect of how do we keep that insulin in check. And that's going to have a lot to do with what we're doing in our diet. One thing I'll just let you know that the process of switching over from utilizing glucose for energy to using ketones for energy that we get from fat is a little bit of a process. In order to actually get that to engage, you have to kind of starve yourself of that glucose in order to get the body to kind of switch over to utilizing fats for fuel to produce ketones. And so that requires really restricting those carbohydrates for a period of time. And so there's a little bit of a transition period there. And as you're doing that, the reduction in the carbohydrates, because that's your primary source that most of us have been using for energy, you can feel a little sluggish during this transition while your body is learning to make that switch over to its optional mode of doing energy from fats. And sometimes this is referred to as the keto flu. It's just kind of some sluggishness as you're kind of switching that switch, becoming what they call fat adapted. But once you become fat adapted, you can very easily move back and forth between the two. It just takes a little bit of effort to get it there because most of us have been so heavily dependent on carbohydrates that we've just never had to use ketones for energy. And it just takes a little bit for our bodies to reset and understand how to do that.
Got one more question in the chat here, Jim. What is the best way to gain muscle mass for vegetarians?
I am not really going to be qualified to speak about vegetarians. I tend to be more on the carnivore side. I rarely eat vegetables. I mostly eat meat. So you've got a couple of challenges with this in terms of the complete proteins that you need to get, which from what I understand, there's ways to combine the different plant elements to try and get those. But the other challenge that you've got with plants is, maybe I'll just back up for a second. An interesting feature of our world is that life feeds on life. In order for us to live, we have to eat other living things, and nothing wants to be eaten. So animals, they have, they either get fast or they have claws or they got horns or something like that. Plants, they can't do any of those things. And the way they protect themselves is by becoming poisonous. And so we've developed ways to tolerate certain poisons. Obviously, there's some plants we just can't touch, but other ones we seem to have developed an ability to counteract or work with some of these poisons. And people will have different tolerances for those poisons. And sometimes those will go up and down in terms of how well we tolerate them. And this is where we can start to get some issues because of dealing with the toxicity from different plants. But in addition to that toxicity, you have to deal with the fact that there's these what are sometimes called anti-nutrients or phytotoxins that can actually help to prevent us from being able to absorb the nutrients that come in the form of plants, or even if we're getting it from other sources when we combine plants and meats together. So from a vegetarian perspective, there's a lot that has to be taken into consideration in terms of how do you combat those phytotoxins and those anti-nutrients, and that can be in terms of how things are prepared. So some things really need to be cooked and other things not. And sometimes when you cook in water, the water needs to be discarded in order to get rid of those anti-nutrients or the phytotoxins. So it's a little bit more complicated. And I would recommend, that you're going to need to talk with somebody who's much more familiar with vegetarian lifestyles. The meat eating side of it is a little bit simpler. It's just kind of already in the right proportions. You just eat it. But yeah, it's a little bit more work that we have to work on with the plants. And it's been a good thing that we evolved in such a way that we can eat plants as well as meat, because then that makes us easier to survive in different situations where food may be more scarce. But there are definitely some challenges in terms of how the body processes different types of foods.
I believe we have one more in here, Jim. Can you review again how to take ketones?
Well, ketones is developed by your body. So when your liver is processing the fats and you have the low insulin levels because you've not been consuming the carbs, it will generate these ketones to be used for energy. And so you don't actually have to take ketones. It's a byproduct of your body converting fat to energy. You can take ketones as well as a supplement, but that's a little bit different than when your body's creating them. And it's really just a matter of restricting the carbs enough that you get the ketones to get created, and then they get used as energy. And I will just say that once you experience getting into ketosis and using some of this in terms of how your brain functions, it is extremely noticeable. I thought I was a pretty high performer before I started doing these things. And it was like realizing I had been asleep all this time, and all of a sudden my brain was just like, ding. It is a powerful effect in terms of how your body reacts to this. And I'll also say it's something that takes a little work in terms of being able to get there. You have to really be careful and track what you're doing in terms of your food initially, because our self-perception of what we're eating is usually not very consistent with how we're actually eating. So you do have to make an effort to get there, but if you do, it has tremendous benefits. And again, not just in the mental clarity and focus and sustainability, but also with these other related health issues. So this is movement. So a lot of us are dealing with stress, either from, too many projects at work, or family problems that are going on, or the events of the world. There's all kinds of things that impact us from a stress perspective. And of course, this will have other hormonal releases that are detrimental to our body in terms of, this consistent state of inflammation. So one of the best ways that we can help to reduce stress is actually just by moving around. Walking is a key one. It's something that most of us can do, and it doesn't require any special equipment. And it is just fantastic for, clearing your head, getting that stress out of your body, and allowing you to refocus. And in general, the more we can keep things flowing and moving in our body, the better. So our circulatory system is not just our heart. Our muscles also are part of that process. So when blood is going to our extremities of our hands and our feet, it's the muscle contractions of our limbs that are actually helping that blood to return back to the heart. So having that regular movement, not just sitting all day. You may have seen me walking on a treadmill desk during a lot of the meetings. This is something I really appreciate, because somebody who's stuck at a desk for a lot of my day, being able to incorporate that movement without having to break work really is helpful. But even just taking quick breaks, Most of us have smart watches of one kind or another that will let us know it's the top of the hour and we really should move around a little bit. Just taking a quick little movement and walking around is going to be highly effective at helping to reduce that stress. If we want to be a little bit more intentional about it, there are things that are called high intensity interval training, where we take something where walking is much more of a low intensity activity. We can mix it in with something that's a little bit more high intensity, and there's ways to get some tremendous benefit from that. That is really helpful in doing it in a short duration. There's a new AI bike out there called Carol, I think is the name of it. And they claim that you can, within 8 minutes, achieve the same benefits as if you were jogging for 40 minutes or something to that effect. It's really ridiculous, like how much it can condense the amount of effort in order to get the same result. But the other thing that's going to be really key is strength training, especially as we're getting older. This is going to help in a number of different ways, including keeping our bones strong. But this is also going to increase the amount of mitochondria that you have. Your muscles make up a big bulk of your body, and the more strength that we have, the greater amount of mitochondria we have. And this is going to, again, help with that energy production. The other thing that happens is as you get more mitochondria in your body, the amount of energy you burn when you're not doing anything, like if you're just lying down, this is called your basal metabolic rate, is going to be higher. And so you're just going to naturally be burning more calories throughout the day just from existing, if we have done some work to improve our strength. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting, really big muscles. It just means that you're getting stronger. And the other thing from a mental perspective is as we are learning different types of activities that require a large amount of whole body coordination. This could be like trying to learn how to juggle, but it could also be, learning a new dance or doing yoga where you have to balance in interesting ways, or Tai Chi or any of these other types of things. This has been shown to have a really profound effect on our mental capacities, especially as we age. So that'd be another key area. So what we've done so far is we've looked at the importance of sleep and how this allows a reset with our brain and how it can be best prepared for how we're going to meet the day. We've looked at how we're feeding our brain in terms of the nutrients that we're eating, how we can work on reducing inflammation and increasing our metabolic health. And we've looked at how movement can also assist in that. The next thing that a lot of us probably need to work on is how we're dealing with our emotions, or we'll say our subjective experience. And so one of the ways I like to talk about this is to help us to realize that we don't always interpret how we're having an emotional experience in the right way. So let me just kind of step through this with what I kind of refer to as this subjective experience cycle. And it's going to start with there's some kind of stimulus. This could be somebody cuts you off in traffic or says something to you, or you notice somebody doing something, or maybe even a thought that you have in your head. And then we have an emotional response that feeds back into that stimulus and can kind of keep circling around, either in positive or negative ways. And it appears that something happens and we just have a response to it. But it's really missing a whole big chunk here. And that is that there's this interpretive process that happens. And we're not always aware of this, but how we interpret something that happens to us is what's generating that emotional response to it. And this is a key thing, because when we recognize that there's this extra step in there that we're maybe not paying attention to, this becomes the key to where we can actually engage in making significant change in terms of what our emotional response is. So a couple of ways that we'll talk about briefly. One is reframing. So if we take the example of the person cutting you off in traffic, my daughter has a friend that says that when she gets cut off in traffic, she likes to think to herself, man, they must really have to go poo. And this is, just a simple way of reframing what happened that totally changes the situation. Because let's say I'm in the car now, somebody cuts me off, and I could just start getting upset. This person wasn't paying attention where they were going, or they were being rude, or they think they own the road, or whatever. And now I'm sitting here with all this emotion and all this anxiety, and it's not good for me, because now I've got all this stress going on in my body and these hormones that are, going through my system. Whereas if I interpreted it differently, like my daughter's friend, now I can just kind of laugh it off, and it's not a big deal. And I can continue on with what's going on with my day. Now, is that what happened with the person? I have no idea. Maybe they just didn't see me. I mean, I've definitely done that myself. But how I'm choosing to look at it then by reframing it is completely changing my emotional reaction to that. And the key is not that we're not paying attention to reality, or that we're not that we're trying to live in make believe land, but so often we have no idea what's going on with the other person. Sometimes we don't even know completely what's going on with ourselves, let alone being able to try and understand someone else. So by finding a more healthy way of framing the situation, giving the benefit of the doubt, allowing for the fact that maybe it was an accident, or maybe they didn't intend to do something, can really change the way that we're experiencing these different things. That's going to give us a very different emotional response to that. And so one of the key things here is to notice when this is happening. So if something is triggering me and causing a particular reaction, I need to start by trying to notice when that's happening, and then ask myself some questions. How am I looking at what just happened that's causing me to feel this way? And this can take a little bit of practice, because we're so used to having what seems like this one-to-one. There's a stimulus, there's a reaction, but not recognizing that first we're actually appraising that in some way. We're interpreting it. We're giving it some kind of value that's then causing the emotional component to it. Once we can catch ourselves and notice that that's what's happening, we have that window then that we can interact, where we can interject, I should say, in terms of reframing that event in such a way that maybe it's not going to cause us the same level of stress or emotional response. And maybe just before I go to the next step here, then I'll pause again and see if there's some thoughts about this subjective experience and how we interpret what's happening that's bringing about that emotional reaction.
I will forever now have say that in my mind. When somebody cuts me off, I won't be able to think of anything else. And that's great. I appreciate the reminder.
Yeah. It definitely struck me when she said that too. I've used it in many presentations.
I I personally struggle with the fact that, as a goody two shoes rule follower, when others do not follow the same rules. And
Mm.
I keep telling myself incorrectly that they're gaining advantage over me that I don't get to get because of I'm following the rules, and I just need to reframe it in terms of the advantage that they're gaining is not really valuable, and they're not winning a lottery just because they got there 20 seconds earlier than I did. And when I meet them at the next light, it's just that you just burn too much fuel anyway. And me trying to hypermile and just get my fuel consumption lower is just actually winning. I'm saving the money that actually moved the world.
Yeah,
It's about reframing.
that's good. So we're coming up on our time, so I want to tackle one last thing here. And this is the idea of mindfulness. And it's really related to that idea of noticing. So sometimes people can get very involved in terms of talking about meditation or mindfulness. I just have a couple of key points that I want to bring up here that I think are helpful. So what we're trying to do with mindfulness is have a curiosity about what's happening in our mind, and to go about it in a non-judgmental way. So if we're, for example, trying to pay attention to our breath or something like that, we might be finding ourselves distracted with all these different thoughts that keep popping up that are taking us away from what we're trying to focus on. We don't want to be upset about those. We want to notice them. And when you just simply notice them, then they seem to kind of lose their power and just kind of trickle away. So this idea of not being judgmental about what's coming through our brain and being more curious about it is really at the core of how we go about this process. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of times what we're trying to do is we're trying to focus our attention on something. And this might be that we're sitting comfortably and just trying to pay attention to our breath, because that's an easy thing that we all do, that you can just notice it and try to notice it in greater detail. But what this is doing then is it's allowing us to practice focusing. So we have a certain amount of neuroplasticity that can happen with our minds, in which the neurons are going to have opportunities to be beneficial or not beneficial in terms of how we use them. So if we're not used to focusing on something starts to build new neural pathways in our brain. And it's like a muscle that will improve with being used. It will allow us to have greater and greater levels of being able to focus our attention the more we actually practice doing it. And there have been studies that have shown that as little as 5 minutes a day on something like this can really improve that ability. So if we struggle with the ability to focus, this is a good way to go about doing that. And part of what we want to do in that focus is just work on deepening that awareness. So if it's something like paying attention to our breath, it's going to be trying to notice all the details of it. What does it feel like as it comes in through our nose, or as our chest or belly expands? And what does it feel like when it comes back out? And so forth. Or you might get into, what is it, the pressure of sitting in my chair, or however I'm sitting, what does that feel like? Or even the different sounds that are around you. There's just ways that we can continue to deepen that awareness of everything that's happening in the present moment. And this is actually going to be building another neural pathway that is being more present. So there's that focus, but there's also being aware of what's happening in the present moment. And this is going to be key, because what distracts us and where a lot of our interpretations come into is being more concerned about what's going to happen in the future, concerns about where things might go, or regrets about something that happened in the past, or glorifying something that happened in the past that's different than now. And so we find more of our time being spent concerned about the future or the past, instead of being in the present moment. And in reality, there's no going back to the past. The past is actually gone and the future isn't here yet. There is only the present moment. So the more that we can actually be present, then a lot of the things that cause us concern tend to have less power, because we realize, okay, this is what's actually happening right now, not what I'm worried about in the future, not what's happened in the past, but in this present moment. And then from that, what can I do? So a key thing then for how we would think about practicing mindfulness is this idea that I'm trying to focus on something, my mind wanders. In a non-judgmental way, I just bring it back to what I was trying to focus on. And that simple practice of just, when we notice the mind wandering, non-judgmentally bringing it back to what we were focusing on, does a tremendous amount to help us to learn how to focus and pay attention, especially to what's happening in the present moment. So we just have a couple of minutes, so I want to see if there's any thoughts on this before I have a couple of closing remarks.
I just found it really some good reminders, but also some things that I haven't thought about or even didn't know that I'm going to look into. So thanks so much. It was really good. Appreciate you doing it.
Yeah. I imagine this might have brought up more questions than answers at this point. It's a quick overview of a lot of different things, but maybe if there's some interest in exploring in more detail any one of these ideas, maybe that'll be something we can do in the future. I have some links here that will be, if you're watching the video, this will be in the notes of the video. Otherwise, I'll get something of this to Katya that she can distribute it to everybody. And then if you're curious about knowing a little bit more about me, you can find me at jimjones.online. And with that, I'll probably stop sharing here for a second and just see if we have any final thoughts that anybody would like to share.
Hey, Jim, I just wanted to reiterate something that I threw in the chat, in case people are following the chat. This was fantastic. Everything you said was absolutely great. And as somebody who's had his own mental illness journey and struggles, some of what you were talking about regarding reframing and getting to that mindfulness state and also leaving the past in the past. If you've had struggles with that, going forward, it can still be a struggle. And don't be afraid to speak with a professional if you're having issues with that.
Yeah.
That's what they're trained to help you identify those triggers, maybe that, whatever did happen in your past that's causing that blockage, to help you, okay, leave it alone, and then help you do that reframing, get to that mindfulness. It's another tool in the toolbox that'll help you get there.
Yeah. Well, in closing, then I just say that if you're interested in participating in any of the other discussions that we do at Kinship Cafe or receiving the videos, you can actually register your email to receive those at www.kinship.cafe. That's KINSHIP.CAFE. And you'll get regular emails about the videos when they come out. There's also links to other Zoom presentations that I do. Yeah, so with that, we'll bring it to a close.
Awesome, Jim. Thank you so much. And again, everyone who did it, people who don't know, you can also join Kinship Cafe with Jim every Friday. You can register an NRU. But Jim, thank you so much. Helping us to recognize Mental Health Awareness Month in May and doing this presentation for us. So thank you so much, everyone, as well, for joining, and we'll see you around. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.